Across the vast spectrum of human thought, there exists a narrow minority of men, roughly estimated at just 2%, whose mental frameworks operate differently from the rest. They are not necessarily more intelligent, but their perception of reality, decision-making processes, and self-regulation distinguish them from the other 98%. These men tend to move through life with an unusual blend of emotional restraint, strategic patience, and a counterintuitive sense of detachment. They see patterns where others see chaos, and they act from principles rather than impulses. Psychology has long tried to understand why such a small fraction of men think this way. From the standpoint of cognitive science, it can be linked to variations in metacognition, the ability to think about one's own thinking. Men in this small cohort demonstrate heightened meta-awareness, meaning they consciously evaluate their emotions, motivations, and choices before acting. In evolutionary terms, this type of mental processing was rare but valuable. It enabled certain individuals to strategize, delay gratification, and anticipate long-term outcomes, behaviors critical for leadership, invention, and survival in uncertain conditions. But in the modern world, this same cognitive architecture often isolates them. Because they are less emotionally reactive, they appear cold. Because they are less socially conformist, they are misunderstood. In social and workplace settings, they often challenge consensus or remain silent while others rush to opinion. They are analytical when the world rewards emotional display, and skeptical when the environment prizes enthusiasm. Psychologists describe this pattern as high cognitive independence, a trait associated with the prefrontal cortex's dominance over limbic reactivity. Such men are not immune to emotion. Rather, they filter emotion through rational calibration. This capacity for emotional regulation, sometimes confused with detachment, is correlated with executive function and reflective intelligence, qualities that make them capable of sustained focus and resilience under pressure. However, this 2% phenomenon is not only biological, it is also philosophical and cultural. Many of these men adopt what could be called a Stoic or metacritical worldview, a philosophy rooted in internal control rather than external validation. They operate from an internal locus of evaluation. They ask not, "What will they think of me?" but "Does this align with my principle?" In psychological terms, they are self-referential thinkers who prioritize integrity of thought over social belonging. This raises a profound question. If such thinking yields greater clarity and self-mastery, why do only a few men reach it? Why does the majority remain governed by social imitation, emotional impulsivity, and cognitive bias? The answer, as psychology reveals, lies in the intersection of neural structure, emotional conditioning, and cultural reinforcement. Thinking independently demands a rare combination: biological predisposition, disciplined reasoning, and a tolerance for loneliness. In the sections that follow, we will examine what defines these men, how their psychology differs from the norm, the scientific foundations behind their thinking patterns, and the personal cost of seeing the world too clearly. 1. Cognitive autonomy, the foundation of rare thinking. At the center of this 2% phenomenon lies a quality psychologists term cognitive autonomy, the capacity to generate, evaluate, and adhere to one's own thoughts independent of external pressure. Most human cognition is socially influenced. We mirror beliefs, adopt group values, and shape opinions through collective validation. Social psychologists call this normative conformity, and it's evolutionarily advantageous. Belonging increased survival odds. Yet, the men within this narrow 2% subset exhibit a psychological inversion of this instinct. Instead of seeking social harmony first, they prioritize conceptual integrity, what makes internal logical sense. This doesn't make them antisocial. Rather, they operate from a higher threshold of evidence before accepting ideas. They require coherence, not comfort. Cognitive autonomy correlates with two measurable traits: low susceptibility to social desirability bias. They are less concerned with how their views are perceived. High need for cognition. They derive satisfaction from complex reasoning itself. A 2018 study in personality and individual differences observed that individuals with a high need for cognition display slower but more accurate decision-making, linked to prefrontal cortical engagement. These are the men who pause before reacting, who ask why instead of what next. In an attention economy culture, such cognitive restraint is a rarity. 2. The architecture of The human brain is not a unified voice, but a dialogue between systems. the limbic system emotion, and the prefrontal cortex reason. For most people, emotion hijacks thought in milliseconds. Feelings become judgments, and judgments become actions. But the 2% operate differently. They have cultivated what neuropsychologists call meta-awareness, the ability to observe their thoughts from a psychological distance. In cognitive behavioral therapy, this skill is referred to as decentering, the recognition that thoughts are not facts. Such men instinctively decide to when anger rises. They identify it as a state, not an identity. When rejected, they experience pain but dissect its source. Neuroscientific research suggests this decoupling stems from heightened activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, an area associated with working memory, moral reasoning, and impulse control. Practically, it means that when 98% of men react, the 2% respond. A crucial difference. While others feel compelled to do something after emotional provocation, they pause. That pause, just a few seconds, creates a cognitive wedge that transforms emotion into data. Over time, this habit hardens into emotional discipline, which in turn becomes perceived as stoicism. 3. The role of delayed gratification. The psychological trait that most predicts success across domains: education, relationships, and health is delayed gratification. Walter Mischel's Marshmallow Test 1972 demonstrated that children who could resist immediate temptation for a greater future reward achieved significantly higher life outcomes decades later. Men within this 2% spectrum internalize delayed gratification not just in behavior but in worldview. They are future-oriented thinkers. Instead of pursuing immediate comfort, they value systems, habits, and long arcs of improvement. Their neural wiring reflects stronger activation of the anterior cingulate cortex, which mediates conflict resolution between desire and restraint. This gives them a heightened capacity for cognitive dissonance, tolerance, the ability to hold discomfort without collapse. For example, where an average man may abandon a long-term goal after frustration, a 2% thinker interprets frustration as part of the algorithm of mastery. This mental reframing creates what psychologists call intrinsic resilience, the strength that doesn't rely on external encouragement. 4. Emotional regulation versus emotional suppression. A common misconception is that these men are emotionless. In reality, they experience emotion deeply but regulate it strategically. Emotion regulation is the process of influencing which emotions we have, when we have them, and how we express them. The distinction between regulation and suppression is critical. Suppression hides emotion, regulation processes it. Research in Effective Neuroscience Gross 2002 shows that suppression increases stress markers, while regulation lowers them. The 2% develop adaptive strategies: reappraisal, reframing, and mindfulness, which allow them to maintain composure without internal decay. This composure manifests externally as calm authority. In conflict, they default to analysis, not aggression. In heartbreak, they retreat to reflection rather than retaliation. Society often misreads this restraint as emotional distance, but it is, in fact, emotional maturity. Hallmark of executive emotional intelligence, EQ. The independence paradox: every advantage bears a shadow. The very autonomy that frees these men also isolates them. Psychology labels this the independence paradox. As self-reliance increases, social belonging often decreases. Humans are tribal by nature, but the cognitively autonomous challenge tribal norms, leading to social alienation or perceived arrogance. Empirical research into high openness and low agreeableness, two traits from the Big Five model, aligns strongly with this group. They value truth over harmony and authenticity over approval. In relationships, this translates into selective intimacy. They prefer solitude to shallow company. Professionally, they resist micromanagement and thrive in self-directed environments. This comes at a cost. Studies from the University of Chicago 2021 reveal that people with high analytical reasoning but low social conformity report higher loneliness scores. Thus, the psychological price of independent thought is often existential solitude. 6. Pattern recognition and systems thinking. Another defining feature of the 2% mindset is systems thinking, the ability to see interconnectedness across apparently unrelated phenomena. This trait aligns with high fluid intelligence (GF) and intuitive abstraction, measured in advanced problem-solving tests. Such men think in terms of if-then chains, probabilities, and dynamic feedback loops. They view social behaviors like economists view markets, through incentives and patterns. This makes them adept at detecting manipulation, propaganda, or emotional leverage. Evolutionary psychologists argue that such pattern seekers descend from strategic planners. In early human tribes, those responsible for predicting migration routes or weather patterns. Their modern descendants may be analysts, engineers, philosophers, or investors' occupations where predictive reasoning outweighs conformity. However, excessive systems thinking can foster cynicism. When everything is seen as cause and effect, human warmth can feel like noise. The challenge for such men is not to lose empathy within the machinery of logic. 7. The cognitive cost of clarity. Thinking clearly in a world built on illusion is cognitively expensive. Psychologists studying cognitive load theory note that sustained reflective thinking consumes mental energy and willpower. The average mind, optimized for efficiency, prefers heuristic shortcuts, stereotypes, emotional reasoning, social proof. The 2% refuse these shortcuts. They expend more glucose in the prefrontal cortex per decision, according to PET scan research Kahneman, 2011. They overanalyze before acting, assess risks others ignore, and simulate scenarios to minimize regret. While this protects them from impulsive mistakes, it also leads to analysis paralysis and chronic mental fatigue. Thus, rare thinking is both gift and burden, clarity without peace. 8. Contrarian thinking and the fear of the majority. Contrarianism is not rebellion for its own sake, it's skepticism toward unverified consensus. In The Spiral of Silence, Noel Newman, 1974. Individuals who perceive their views as minority opinions self-censor to avoid social exclusion. The 2% violate this principle. They speak even when silence is safer. This defiance stems from what psychologists term epistemic courage, the willingness to face cognitive dissonance and social backlash for truth. Historically, such individuals have driven intellectual revolutions. Galileo Nietzsche Friedel demonstrated a refusal to bend under majority thinking. Modern examples are quieter: the employee who questions unethical company policy, the man who chooses purpose over popularity, or the thinker who rejects algorithmic thinking online. Their courage is intellectual, not performative, but it exacts a toll: reputation risk, misunderstanding, and in extreme cases, ostracism. 9. The role of environment and upbringing. No man is born purely rational. Cognition is sculpted through environment. Studies in developmental psychology show that secure attachment in childhood, consistent love without overprotection, fosters independent reasoning later in life. Boys raised to think critically, rather than to obey blindly, develop stronger internal loci of control. Conversely, men from authoritarian or emotionally chaotic homes often develop external validation dependency. They crave approval because they equate it with safety. The 2% break this cycle. They internalize validation. They measure success against principle, not applause. Yet this often emerges from early adversity. Traumatic or isolating experiences push some men into introspection as survival. Pain becomes the forge of perception. Therefore, psychological independence is frequently born from emotional deprivation, transformed by reflection into strength. 10. Philosophical frameworks. Stoicism, existentialism, and cognitive realism. 3 philosophical currents frequently underpin the 2% mindset. Stoicism, focus on controlling one's reactions, not external events. This aligns with modern cognitive behavioral principles. Ellis, 1955, emphasizing perception over circumstance. Existentialism, recognition that meaning must be self-constructed. Men who think deeply accept absurdity yet act with purpose, echoing Camus' concept of defiant meaning. Cognitive realism, acceptance of reality as it is, stripped of comforting illusions. Such realism guards against naive optimism and fosters adaptive decision-making. These frameworks collectively inoculate the mind against manipulation and despair. They grant psychological armor in an emotionally volatile world. 11. Behavioral markers of the 2% mind. Empirical identification of such men is complex. Yet common behavioral markers include strategic silence. They speak rarely but with precision. Selective empathy, compassion directed through discernment, not obligation. Information minimalism, preference for depth over quantity of input. Moral independence, judgments anchored in principle, not popularity. Emotional sovereignty. Even under provocation. reflective solitude, regular engagement in introspection or journaling. In sociological surveys, these traits often correlate with introverted intuition and thinking dominance typologies, Jungian, MBTI. However, labels oversimplify a deeper phenomenon. These men have integrated cognition and emotion into a unified, self-directed system. 12. The societal consequence of rare thinkers. Every society depends on minority thinkers for evolution. Innovation, reform, and truth-telling emerge not from consensus but from cognitive divergence. Yet modern institutions, corporations, media, and even education favor conformity. Standardized testing rewards memorization, not synthesis. Social media rewards emotion, not reason. Thus, the proportion of independent thinkers may not be shrinking biologically but culturally suppressed. Psychology warns that when societies discourage reflection, they produce what Fromm called automaton conformity, humans who think they are free yet act by algorithm. The 2% resist this automation, often at personal cost. They may not always be celebrated, but civilization advances on their shoulders. 13. Adaptive balance. The ideal integration. The goal is not to romanticize the 2%, but to understand their equilibrium. Pure rationality without empathy leads to detachment. Emotion without reason leads to chaos. Psychological maturity is the integration of both the cognitive-emotional synthesis. Men who achieve this synthesis maintain moral conviction without rigidity, empathy without manipulation, and focus without tunnel vision. They embody what psychologist Abraham Maslow described as self-actualized individuals, those who have transcended basic psychological dependencies to pursue authenticity and contribution. 14. The future of cognitive individualism in the digital era. Algorithms predict thought. Echo chambers amplify emotion, and attention is currency. To think independently today is an act of quiet rebellion. Psychologists predict that future well-being will depend not on IQ but on metacognition, intelligence to manage one's own cognition amidst distraction. The 2% represent the prototype of this future human, disciplined, self-aware, slow to react, immune to mass hysteria. As automation replaces labor, reflective thinking will replace reaction as the most valuable human skill.